Right, well, I think I'll kick off then. So welcome. This is week 6 already. Isn't that scary how quickly the semester is zooming by? Okay. And I'll be talking to you about Australia and New Zealand, but I hope to put it in a broader context because I'm well aware that not everybody is interested in Australia and New Zealand. Of course, you should be, but if you're not, well, never mind. Okay, there's still plenty to learn that you can generalize from the particular to the general. There's lots of lessons. Okay, I'll speak more generally to the situation with the pandemic and study abroad, what it means for yourselves, possible disruptions to study abroad, because apart from, of course, being Australian and following developments in Australian and some degree New Zealand higher education, actually one area of my research is quite explicitly universities and marketing of universities, university campus design. I have a large Kaken grant on Koto Kyoiku no Shijoka no Kaken no Kenkyu project もやってるし, I have an EU project, which is more on kind of cultural diplomacy stuff, but education's part of it. So I pay attention to lots of these things. Some of you already know me, those of you who are taking Introduction to Business course too. So a way of introduction. So Christopher Beccaria, but lots of the SIL students have called me over the years Poka-chan, and if you look at my website, pokachan.com, in fact, I'll do a screen share and show you straight away. Not particularly about me, but more, there's a couple of Australia-related resources on it, okay? So not as much here as there used to be. This was a kind of a one starting point for courses, but because I still do a website for every class that I teach, but with the start of Moodle last year, I don't use this as much. So Chukyu, Enshu, and Intermediate, and for Newmon, Introduction to Business, I used to put lots of resources here, and there's still some resources there. But most of it I've brought into Moodle. But a couple of strange videos that are here that may be interesting for you to check out at the top here. There are two extraordinarily well-known kind of comedians in Australia, these guys, Roy and HG. They've been for the longest time. They do sports commentary, but it's not really sports commentary. It's more kind of comedy. For many, many years, what they've done is for major sporting events, including the Olympics, they invite people to turn the TV on, turn the sound down to 0, and they do an alternative narrative, which gets really, really, really bizarre. But it's a whole lot of fun. There's a bit of a kind of a national tradition, and they very much encapsulate a very distinctly Australian thing and New Zealand thing of not taking things very seriously. And the more people act seriously, the more they deserve to be taken not seriously at all. So you can see here when they're in keeping with the Tokyo Olympic spirit, they are doing calls of particular events here. So it gets kind of weird. That's something completely different. That's Woody Allen. And some of you may know the genre of Hitler parody videos. The reason I've got this here is because I offered this last year, but no one actually nominated themselves. But I'm going to stop the share now. With online teaching, I thought there was wonderful opportunity to ruthlessly parody professors, because there are lots of interesting things been happening. If you want to check out, not now, later on, check out Room Rater, for example, which started on Twitter, and still on Twitter, but got on Instagram and wider. A guy in America who started rating the rooms of people who were doing online interviews on American television, and became a huge thing. And there's lots of really interesting kind of sites and whatnot where people do screenshots of the absolutely the worst online teaching experience they've had to have and various things. So I actually offered a reward for the best cruel parody of me teaching online, but no one's taken it up yet. So it's kind of disappointing. In Australia, definitely. Lots of people would have done. So I put them as examples of what you can do. Right here, so I'm going to go over to the very same document that you've got. I'm actually going to run this off the PDF rather than Keynote, which I normally work in. I think it's a bit more stable in PDF with a large file. And this is being recorded, and eventually I will edit up, put the recording up as well. But as per usual, you'll have your 4 questions you have to ask. So you have to pay some attention here. I'll make the areas that are likely to be covered by the quiz pretty obvious to you if you pay attention. And then the lecture material will be available to you from midnight on the 20th. So after the clock turns hits 12 tomorrow night, and Cinderella flees, and your carriage turns into a pumpkin, blah, 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 then the lecture notes will be available. So let's go to the screen share. Now, the first thing I'm going to say is, growing up in Australia, I hate weather like today. Grey weather, and a bit humid, and yeah, no big blue skies. That really depresses me. As an Australian, actually, I'll stop this and briefly speak the camera because I forgot to give my background here. As an Australian, one of the things I've realized over the years when people ask me, you know, what it is that's distinct about the Australian experience and what do you miss about home? And I'm happy, very happy living in Tokyo. I generally think, oh, not much. I don't really think about it until I have a big blue sky day. Now that could be lying on my back in the middle of Shinjuku going in the spring, for example, or it can be up on the mountain in the middle of a winter, standing up on the mountain, snowboarding, looking at the big blue sky, and I realize what I miss is big skies. That's one of the quintessential Australian experiences. And once when I was thinking about kind of longer term retirement plans, when I get old and retire, where would I want to spend different parts of the year? I definitely want to be in Japan in the autumn and the winter. I absolutely love that. I love the winter here. Tokyo is crystal clear, and over in Niigata and whatnot, there's wonderful snow. And I didn't see snow until I was an adult. So growing up in Australia, seeing snow here is wonderful. You can go snowboarding and skiing in Australia, but in the south, and I lived further north. But that the big skies, you know, the vast horizon and a sense of openness is a very distinctive Australian thing. New Zealand, on the other hand, and there's a Maori expression for it too. New Zealand's often referred to as the over the long white cloud. New Zealand gets cloudier. On the other hand, New Zealand is the most breathtakingly beautiful country I have ever been in. Every time I go to New Zealand, you know, I'm just astounded by how ridiculously beautiful the place is. It kind of comes close. Parts of Japan come close. In fact, you can think of to some degrees New Zealand as Japan without the industry and 120 million people and the pachinko parlors and the power lines cluttering the place up. So there's an element of that. Norway is absolutely stunningly beautiful. And in a very different way, I would probably rate Jordan and Israel, Middle East there, because it's just spectacular, but very, very different. But yeah, I think probably New Zealand's my winner in terms of beautiful countries. But Australia doesn't have the same dramatic landscapes, but instead we get the big blue skies. And so when I was looking for the data on where I would like to live, And my idea is to move every 4 or 5 months or whatever around, as a kind of a happy retiree, 17 years, 16 years time. And I was looking at statistics on, how much sunshine, how many hours of sunshine in the world in certain given places. Now, there are a few places that have huge amounts of sunshine, and they're all deserts, okay? So not that inhabitable. And very often the sunshine comes with, such as it does in, say, Arizona, 40-degree heat, 45-degree heat in the middle of the day. And so then I narrowed the search to hours of sunshine and a decent range of temperatures. And lo and behold, I think the second best scoring place in the world was Brisbane in Australia, where I was born. I thought, that's kind of weird. Go out of Australia, live all of these years in Japan, travel in so much of the world. And then when I look for kind of metrics of, livability, I find back home kind of tops the charts. Okay. But then again, maybe the very reason why I was actually Googling in the first place, those kind of things, is because I've internalized that. And maybe there's a little bit of kind of craving for the familiar from when I was young. There's much more to life, of course, than big skies. But one of the really striking things is that it can just make such a very big difference to your mood. It's just a bit more difficult to be a bit grumpy and nasty when it's a nice clear day and those grand horizons, I don't know, they seem to provoke a degree of optimism in people. So I grew up in Australia. My parents were teachers, high school teachers, most of the time, although my dad kept quitting being a high school teacher and being a photographer and going back to being a high school teacher and then doing both. So I moved around a bit in the state of Queensland, and I'll show you that on the map later on, with my parents being transferred. So I lived in little towns. I lived in the state capital. I went to the University of Queensland. I'll show that later on, both an undergraduate and master's degree there. Came to Japan on a working holiday visa, ended up staying in Japan for 3 years, spending some time in Europe, went back to Australian National University, which I will also show, where I did my PhD. And then I went to work in the Japanese Consulate General, Nihon Soudai Ujikan, in Sydney for a bit, and just for a bit. And then I became an academic at Queensland University of Technology, Queensland Kokkadaigaku, which is not a Waseda partner, in central Brisbane, not far away from Griffith and University of Queensland, which are both Waseda partners, and I know those institutions very well as well. And so I was there, and then when SILS was created in 2004, I was hired as regular faculty. So I'm one of the kind of minority of current SILS professors who've been here right from the beginning of SILS, actually. And when I came on board, I was very quickly asked to help out with study abroad programs and the development of them, because that's something I'd been doing for an Australian university, kind of running program with Japan and other places, and some of my research related to university marketing and whatnot, as I mentioned. So I found myself doing, having, as well as teaching in SILS, also having an advisory role over in the Kokuseibu Ryugak Center for quite a few years. Now, I haven't done that for quite a number of years now. So I went on sabbatical to Israel for a year, actually, 2013, and then back to Australia, to Australian National University for a while. And so since then, I haven't been directly involved in the Ryugak Center, but up to the end of 2012, which seems like ages ago for you guys, doesn't seem so long ago for me, I was very involved in the development of study abroad programs. So I have a very good sense of the history of Waseda's partnership with places like Australia and New Zealand, having been involved in some of the setting up of some of the programs, but also quite familiar with some other areas, particularly parts of Europe. Some of you know, those who've taken my classes always say this. My own daughter was a student in SILS since graduated. And she actually chose to go to Denmark, to Copenhagen Business School. And I know that institution quite well, and that was a choice I encouraged. So I've got multiple perspectives on here. I'm not just kind of pushing people to go to Australia. And indeed, for certain kinds of students, given the timing of the study abroad in Australia, it may not be the best thing for you to do. But for some people, it would be an excellent choice. I will say more about Corona and the implications, what's with Australia and New Zealand, because right now you can't go. But for many of you, you're looking to go in the fall of next year or even the spring of the following year. So then they become very viable options. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into my slide set here. Excuse me just a moment, I'll put the air conditioning on, I'll be back. Had the window open, but my office here in Sills, but there's a bit of construction going on. Okay, so big blue skies, but you get big, beautiful skies here in the fall and the winter. You don't get many nice swimming pools in Japan. That's one of my ongoing sources of frustration. Let me finish my coffee here. Okay, fortunately, I didn't get much sleep last night doing various things. Okay, let's dive into some details. Common images of Australia and New Zealand. Of course, Maori culture is very striking. If you do go to New Zealand on study abroad, I strongly urge caution in terms of getting a full face tattoo. Probably not so good for your shukatsu if you get back to Japan. そうとかっこいいと思うんだけど、就活にちょっと悪影響かな。全面入れずに。だからしっかり考えてください。By the way, a friend of mine, his brother got very rich running a bar in Colorado in a university town. Next to his bar, he has a tattoo parlor. And quite a lot of the students went to the bar, then went to the tattoo parlor, which was kind of a 24-hour kind of tattoo parlor. And I'm sure the very next morning kind of regretted it, but it was a very good co-location business model. So from a Japanese point of view, and particularly rugby point of view, you may know the All Blacks rugby union team, all in all the best rugby team in the world, we would argue, just statistically over the years. Certainly one of the most interesting, anyone's a rugby fan. I actually much more enjoy watching a All Blacks game than I do an Australian game. By the way, the All Blacks pretty routinely beat the Australians as well. Now, New Zealand, as I said, it's a beautiful place. Some of you know I teach, teaching the business here. So teaching along with Morimoto Sensei. One of the things I do work on is place branding and place promotions. New Zealand is easy to sell because it is so beautiful in the first place, but also they have one of the most successful branding strategies of every country. They've been using this catch copy of 100% pure New Zealand. And from a branding point of view, that's really good because you can use 100% pure New Zealand with anything. You can pretty much overlay it over in anything. Japan is a strong brand, but it's all been a bit embarrassing with the government embracing the cool to Japan discourse because it's just not cool to describe yourself as cool, okay? Which is inherently a problem. Lest you think that's just a very rare image. No, New Zealand really is ridiculously beautiful like that, okay? You'll see routinely the New Zealanders have a very subtle, quirky, quite endearing sense of humor. So here's one of the bits of branding, 100% pure New Zealand. Come now, if not sooner, okay? By the way, Roy and HG, who I mentioned before, the Australian kind of comedians, they have a very famous expression, and I think pretty much all Australians know it. They say too much sport is never enough. On a day when too much sport is never enough, there is this sporty thing in Australia and New Zealand. That's not exactly me, but to all Australians, or the vast majority of Australians, the shorthand version of Roy and HG, too much is never enough, is a well-known expression, okay? And I think in New Zealand, too much beauty is never enough. Of course, if we keep with the sports angle, that's a very old image, when Australia broke Japanese hearts by scoring a goal unexpectedly a long time ago, but then the player involved, that really tall guy, he then went to play for Nagoya, so the went full circle. So in the soccer, very often Japan and Australia have been friendly rivals for qualification, which has been an interesting thing. Aside from the sport, historically in post-war Japan, particularly from the 1970s, Australia, Goshu, was very much associated with being a very large and growing supplier of key raw materials for Japanese industry. Still now, 2/3 of all of Japan's iron ore exports come from Australia. To put it in perspective, although Australia overwhelmingly is a modern services-based economy with some of the highest per capita incomes in the world and some of the highest growth rates in developed countries. In fact, per capita incomes in Australia are higher than the US, so it's right up there with Scandinavia. But nonetheless, the resources sector is still a major source of prosperity for Australia. Something like $100 billion trade. It's estimated that the resources sector adds up something to like 10% of GDP. But it's a trade that's generally very remote from the lives of most Australians. It happens in very distant places. The iron ore that come from these enormous mines, and you don't get a sense of just how big that is unless you can actually see some people, and there's hardly anyone there. Very remote locations on enormous, absolutely enormous scale, and contributes greatly to prosperity. But the vast majority of Australians have never been to an iron ore mine. They've never been to a coal mine. They probably don't know people working in them. My brother did work in one mine for a while. He was originally an architect, involved in project management. There is the fly-in, fly-out phenomena. Some people earn a lot of money working in remote locations, but it's very distant from the day-to-day lived experience in Australia. Now, Australia and Japan relations are incredibly tight. This is the current Australian Prime Minister and the Japanese Prime Minister, of course. The Prime Minister, not long after Suga-san became Prime Minister, Australian Prime Minister was, I think, the first foreign dignitary to visit, flew up on an overnight flight, did the friendly chat, the Iccie, put their masks quickly back on, and then he went home for compulsory 2 weeks quarantine, like all Australians have to do. Another increasing image for those of you interested in international relations, you might know that the Quad is getting a lot of attention. That's Australia, Japan, the United States, and India. But particularly in the Asia Pacific, of course, both Australia and Japan have a very strong security partnership with the United States. In fact, Australia's only formal security partnership is with the United States, informally, of course, with Britain, historically. And so a remarkably similar situation to Japan. And so it's very much a triangular relationship with a lot of mutual cooperation. Actually, just simply days before the full impact of Corona, so this was in very beginning of March last year, I was in Guam at the Western Hotel, and there were a whole bunch of US fighter pilots, Australian fighter pilots, and Japanese fighter pilots all kind of checked in together. They were doing operations together and hanging out on the beach. And it was a very, very nice thing to see. I realized the full extent of the collaboration. Okay, so just some pictures for that. Okay. Now, there is this kind of paradox that Australia is huge, and we call it a red centre, large lump of the middle of Australia. Of course, there's hardly anybody there. There are small communities, Aboriginal communities in the remote dead centre of Australia. Most settlements most of the population is around 7 key urban centres. And of course, Sydney, perhaps being the most famous by far. Second largest city being Melbourne, then Brisbane, and then a bit of a runoff. We then have Perth and Adelaide, Darwin and Hobart subsequently. Okay. Now, this is midwinter, relatively mild weather there. Central, I've just got 3 views laid across here. The centre of Australia, very red, call it the red centre. You go out in the, what we call the bush, okay? Often very dense, kind of green, except sometimes you have terrible bushfires. Actually, just before COVID as well, we had terrible bushfires in Australia. In fact, I was just back there, came back to Tokyo, went to Guam for a few days, got back, and then bang, haven't been able to go anywhere ever since. And then the Gold Coast, very well known to Japanese tourists, played key roles in the economy there from the late 80s into the 1990s. I was born and raised in Queensland, moved around a lot of time in Brisbane. The Gold Coast is quite close until very, very recently. My parents were living just behind the Gold Coast in a place called Mount Tamborine, and so I spent so much time on the Gold Coast. Okay, so Australia tends to stand out, of course, for its animals, and they are pretty much everywhere. Famous wallabies and whatnot. This was around not so far from where my parents were living. Okay, so you do see signs here, and that one was actually in. It's literally as I'm finishing my coffee now. I was drinking my coffee and it bounced across in front of me and stopped in the garden. So I took a picture of it. So you do get to mix with the wildlife. Actually, there are more kangaroos and wallabies in Australia now than at the time of first white settlement, because all of those lawns, all of those crops that are grown intensively, it is absolutely paradise for kangaroos and wallabies. They don't have to make much effort chewing tough grasses and whatnot. They devour the lawns, for example, of the Australian National University campus and whatnot. Now, another image, maybe more of your parents' generation, you might know, the kind of the original Mad Max, Mel Gibson and the original Mad Max, okay, which really featured desert landscapes and characters, and was a little bit of a kind of apocalyptic kind of scenario. Of course, overwhelmingly urban lifestyles don't quite fit that image. The reality is Australia and New Zealand have both been incredibly prosperous until COVID. In the Australian case, it had no recession. So for 29 years of straight economic growth, okay? So you saw amongst OECD nations the highest sustained rates of economic growth. One of the implications here is Australia and New Zealand have both become very wealthy, very prosperous countries. Kind of you can think of them in a fundamental sense as a bit like the Scandinavia of the South Pacific. Very strong emphasis on very nice outdoor lifestyle, for example. This is Sydney again. You get onto the university campuses. The campuses, I don't really know an ugly university campus in Australia. Several of the city campuses have really dramatically invested in upgrading themselves, revitalizing the campus experience. I'm thinking of UTS, like University of Technology in Sydney. That's not actually a Waseda partner, but they have been quite prosperous with international students. So I'm going to talk more about this in a moment, but have been hit very hard by COVID. Let's talk about what partners we have, first of all. First thing to note is for Australia and New Zealand that all of Waseda's partners are very prestigious universities. They're all very highly ranked. Several reasons for this. We'll see what we call the group of 8 in the Australian case, and then Auckland and Christchurch, for example. The older universities were where foreign language studies tended to be concentrated. and humanities and whatnot. So very strong Japanese language programs at places like the University of Melbourne. Sydney was a real pioneer in Japanese language studies anywhere in the world, actually, back in the 1930s. And actually, some of the people involved in breaking Japanese codes during World War II had studied Japanese at the University of Sydney. The Japanese military in World War II hadn't imagined that there were foreigners who really understood Japanese. And they knew that there were some kind of Nikkei folks, of course, in the United States, but really underestimated the military intelligence capabilities that the British and Australians and others were able to mobilize, because actually there had been long-standing interest in Japan. So some of these most prestigious universities have had a long commitment to engagement in a very positive way after the war with Japan. And so naturally, there have been established relationships between Waseda, which was certainly the most dynamic since the 1960s of all Japanese universities in developing exchange programs, hosting international students. For example, Keio was a bit slower, but has done some stuff. Todai and the other national universities were very, very slow. So Waseda, I know because I was on the Australian side, and at once upon a time, I was actually the secretary of the Japanese Studies Association of Australia, even though Japanese studies is not exactly my thing, but that's what I kind of ended up doing. So very strong sense of the thinking amongst people in Australian universities involved in Japanese studies. And Waseda was always the kind of the number one preferred partner to send international students to, particularly when SILS developed, because we have such a wide range of curriculum in English. So we're in a very strong position then in 2004 when we went to develop new programs. So we went to the University of Queensland, to Sydney, to Australian National University, and Melbourne really wanted to do things on exchange, so we expanded our numbers there. University of Auckland as well, I was there and negotiating, developing these things. So very good partners. So you get to go to top institutions in the country. Practical things, for some of you, this might really matter. Very vibrant social life. Typical university campuses, you're not stuck in the middle of nowhere, okay? 18 drinking age, for some of you that matters significantly. Well, I'd say the reverse. We keep having problems of Waseda students who ignore the 21 drinking age in the United States and getting in trouble, okay? All of our partner universities, except for the ANU, are near a beach. That's another attraction, and world-class beaches, okay? The ANU has a lake, but it's not Bondi Beach, okay? There's only a 1 to 3 hour time difference from Japan. Perth is where the 3 hours kicks in. The East Coast is only 1 hour time difference. In summer, it's a 2 hour difference. Migrant societies, about a third of Australian and New Zealand residents are foreign born. Now, there's also huge interest in Japan. The sheer economic linkages and cultural linkages over the years, political linkages are really, really strong. But not so many Japanese students in the university. So one of the implications here is that you'll be very welcomed as a Japanese, but you're not going to be just one of the many, okay? And so that puts you in a good position. Now, here's some really practical stuff you immediately need to engage with, okay? First of all, exchange programs. The one really frustrating thing for me all of those years, and I was 10 years advising in the New York Center. Of course, the Australian Embassy, I was very closely connected with the people in the education side in the Australian Embassy and whatnot. In fact, I've done things for them, and even talking to high school principals and over Japan and help promote Australian education and whatnot. The problem has always been that the academic calendar doesn't quite line up. It kind of lines up, but doesn't quite line up. So because it's Minami Hankyu, so the Southern Hemisphere, effectively the seasons are reversed. So the long summer holiday, of course, is from November through to mid-February. And traditionally you had the orientation week, so the welcome happened in the 2nd or the 3rd week of February, and classes started in the last week of February. The ANU has historically started kind of March the 1st roundabout. Okay, so that works fine, you know, so you can finish up here in the end of January, and then absolutely perfect for getting away. You have a bit of time. Go and enjoy the winter and then go to the late summer. So that absolutely works fine. Where it, no problem on exchange. So perfect to do that. And indeed, coming back, it works out very nicely because the winter break is very, very short in Australia and New Zealand. So you finish up your first semester, the winter break is only a couple of weeks. It's only like 3 weeks. And then, so effectively in late July, or Corky, the second semester starts, and then you're typically finished by classes by the end of October. Normally exams run a bit later. Certainly by mid-November, you're finished, okay? So it's quite possible to do 2 full semesters in Australia and New Zealand on exchange. So you go down after you've finished Corky here, so you leave in February, and then you come back in mid-November. You can stay on and enjoy the summer if you want, but you don't actually then have to be doing anything at Waseda again until the following April. So that has been very useful for shukatsu for some people, you know, because your shukatsu typically is from kind of, you know, late fall semester in your 3rd year. So those kind of people wanting to do, for example, get a job in Muscombe, this was actually very attractive because the time frame of recruitment tended to be a bit earlier than usual. Although recruitment is so messed up these days with Kate 100 and different policies and everything. So there's absolutely no disadvantage to shukatsu. In fact, an advantage if you go on exchange in Australia or New Zealand. So in practice, what we're talking about here is for you to go in February 2022, okay? That would be the departure point. But of course, many of you will be thinking, but hang on. No, doesn't the SILS curriculum say study abroad is, in general, the standard pattern from fall of your 2nd year? Yes, but if you want to go on exchange, you can delay, and a number of people do this as well. They delay it, okay? So, of course, the recruitment is already over for spring of next year. And I'll come back to this later on, but frankly, and I feel sorry for anyone who's actually already accepted to go to Australia and New Zealand from February next year, it's not certain that they will be able to go. The reason being is actually the border of both countries is closed, and both governments have announced that they're effectively not opening borders up fully until the vast majority of the population has been vaccinated. And the vaccination programs in both countries have been running quite slow, quite behind. On the Australian case, the reason is Australia is very unusual in it actually has its own vaccine manufacturing capability, which should have given Australia a huge advantage. The problem was that first of all, they held great hope for a vaccine developed by the University of Queensland. The vaccine itself worked very well, but it had a bizarre side effect in that if you had a HIV test, chances are you would show positive for HIV even if you didn't have it, which was considered to be completely unacceptable. So they stopped continuing the development of the vaccine. Then they switched to a license arrangement for the AstraZeneca vaccine and were to mass produce that at an Australian facility in Melbourne, and they are. But there's been some complications with AstraZeneca with blood clots. So the recommendation is that people under 50 don't use AstraZeneca. And the problem is the government didn't have other contracts to buy at scale the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccines. Now they do, but the program has been delayed. So originally the government's position was that everyone should be vaccinated by November. And then the goal was to open up the borders and international students would all come back from February next year. this is looking catastrophically wrong now. So the likely situation is borders will be open from middle of next year, and the Australian government pretty much explicitly said that last week in official documents, and the Prime Minister just on Monday said that's the most likely scenario. That said, we can be very confident, however, that in spring of 2022, in the Japanese sense, so from February, that borders will be open then. One of the interesting things, different from a lot of places, is Australia and New Zealand, but particularly in the Australian case now, they made it even more liberal. You can work part-time in a semester and full-time during the break. And indeed, because there is such a shortage of workers now, because the economy is booming, but the borders have been closed, that the government announced last week that actually international students can work up to 40 hours a week, okay, which is a lot of people saying that's crazy, that's too much, okay? And there is such a shortage. Indeed, the guy who owns the largest number of kind of restaurants, pubs and whatnot in Sydney says that he currently has 800 job vacancies, okay? So kind of will hire anybody. So I'm very, very conscious that not everyone here is thinking of going to Australia and New Zealand. And some of you are pretty much just here for information about how, you know, higher education system works in general, you know, and looking at this kind of, you know, a comparative perspective on higher education. So I'm serving two purposes with the slides. I'm talking about some specific things with our programs, but I also want to set the broader context. Also providing information which will be helpful for you beyond the cases of Australia and New Zealand. So you can use this data to think about other places as well. Let me have a final swig of my now rather cold coffee. Okay, this is, as it says, participation in higher education systems. So what percentage of a population go on to university is the Koto Kyoiku no Sanka Wariai. What's really striking is the green is 2000 and the blue is 2012. You know, so if we look at these statistics here, what we can see is ever increasing tendency for the proportion of the population to go to university. So this is adults who have attained a tertiary level of education. It's natural that the statistics rise because, simply put, as elder people go to the next world, pass away, become eternal, get the wings, whatever kind of expression you want to use. Many of them, of course, didn't have the opportunity to go to university. It's a very modern thing for it to become quite normalized to go to university. Now, a substantial majority of high school graduates go on to higher education. So naturally, that percentage increases substantially. What is interesting is some countries already were a lot higher in the first place. And those numbers, we can capture this at 2000. We already get a sense of how advanced they were. The United States, strikingly so. For example, Finland, the Netherlands, very high. A lot of other countries have rapidly accelerated in terms of encouraging the proportion of their population to go on to university. A lot of it comes down to how much governments put money into higher education, but it also sometimes is about how much individuals are prepared to pay themselves, families. And what we see, interestingly, as a percentage of GDP, how much is actually spent on universities, Australia and Japan are remarkably kind of similar. We see some other countries are even higher. And so particularly Japan looks a little bit lower. What's different is Australia and Japan look very similar, but actually, if you went on to Australian university campuses, you'd be stunned by how beautiful many of the buildings are, a lot of the facilities and whatnot. And you would say, well, hang on, you know, Japanese universities are okay, but how do they afford this in the Australian case? You know, if as a percentage of GDP, what's being spent in terms of public and money, why are the Australian universities so much more spectacular in general than Japanese universities? Really, the huge difference is full fee paying international students. Australian university education became a very significant export industry. That's the critical thing, okay? A couple of things quickly, particularly about our partners. We shouldn't think about universities as just teaching oriented. Remember, the universities serve multiple purposes. You're focused on them as a student, but I'm sure, as you know, your professors, you think maybe spend too much time on research. Research is a critical function of the universities. Now, different types of institutions, this is more or less true. If you go to community colleges and liberal arts colleges in the United States, very often more teacher-centered, less research-centered. Really big universities, we'd say Sogo Daigaku, the major ones with very strong branch, in the United States, overwhelmingly research-centered. Only a small, very small proportion of people, for example, who are employed at Harvard as academic staff are actually teaching. Now, this is true at the major Australian universities too. Most recent statistics, the University of Queensland, more than half of all of the faculty, academic staff, don't teach. They're in pure research positions, okay? So these are, you have to think of them as a huge cluster of not just faculties for teaching, but of kind of world-class research institutes. That there are so many people there who go to a laboratory to work, they work in the university, and they don't see students, okay? Generally, research rankings, university rankings reflect research performance. To keep this in perspective, if I don't have time to do it here, but I've done it elsewhere, and if anyone's ever interested, I can share slides. If you put University of Queensland and Waseda alongside each other, what you see is that University of Queensland has much larger income from research. It also has much larger income from international students as well. So one of the implications here is that it's kind of harder for Waseda to be, scoring really high in the rankings when the faculty members are doing most of what they do is in practical terms, even though I've got a lot of really good researchers here, mostly what they're doing is teaching and administration and trying to squeeze the research in, okay? Broader implication of when you co-locate the research and the teaching, you get a very vibrant intellectual life on campus. Lots of research institutes bring a lot of really interesting people there, lots of seminars and whatnot. And so in a sense, and this is why I want to do this in a kind of a comparative higher education sense, first of all, it was the Germans who figured this out at scale, the Humboldtian University, to have these leading researchers co-located with the teaching function. And then, of course, it came to its peak in the big American universities, some of you heard of, the likes of Stanford and whatnot, where the complementarities there, that you would have brilliant young people involved in being doctoral researchers, but they'd also be available as teaching assistants, for example. So kind of mutual support. I want to speak a little bit to New Zealand. I've mostly been talking about the Australian case. So actually, very long history of this. University of Otago. Otago is down in the south, and Dunedin, okay? This was actually the very first college, okay? And University of Otago, and there were branch campuses in the other cities, Auckland, what was called Canterbury College, and Victoria University College in Wellington. Later on, they become independent institutions. Now, Auckland, of course, is the major city in New Zealand these days, and Wellington is the capital. So some people may have wondered why Dunedin. Dunedin's a gorgeous place. Several reasons. The South Island of New Zealand, there was a huge gold rush. Actually, lots of gold was discovered in centrally there, not far from Queenstown, which is now these days snowboarding kind of heaven, bungee jump heaven. But so there was a significant resources trade there, but also just the nature of mobility. Historically, before aeroplanes, people arrived by ship, okay? And ships travel on the ocean. And of course, to go to New Zealand, effectively what you had to do was sail right down past the west coast of Australia, go along the bottom of Australia, and then get to New Zealand. So the entry point by ship was from the south. So Dunedin was the first port of call, quite literally. With air travel, that kind of reverses. You can fly over the top. And so Auckland has overwhelmingly become the key point of arrival, okay? In a similar kind of way, you know, when the first American contacts with Tokugawa Japan actually were through Okinawa. Just no, sorry, what am I saying? Forgive me. No, Otaru. Okay, no, the other end, right? It was the Portuguese and the others who came that way. So the Americans tended to come across the top. So changes in transport have changed the geographies of connection. So anyway, our key partners, our Waseda partners, and I've highlighted them here with these little colored stars. Okay, whoops, where'd I go? These little gold stars I've got here are our partners. Auckland University of Technology is a separate institution. It's like a polytechnic, but they're very good in terms of digital content industries and whatnot. So this is the map of Australia, pretty difficult to read, but I'm just going to zoom through it anyway. Bunch of our partners there in various places. Okay. So I just want to emphasize that our partners were all early elite universities. Each state capital, let me go back again, each of these were actually separate British colonies, and then they were unified in 1901 into one nation. Originally, Western Australia was not going to be in, and New Zealand was going to be in. And of course, the joke has long been that, you know, thank God it didn't work out that way, because imagine every kid in primary school who had to draw a map of the country, had to draw a map of Australia with no Western Australia, but New Zealand in instead. It kind of lacked a little bit of kind of stylistic coherence. The Tasmanians, by the way, keep getting annoyed when people forget to draw Tasmania. So there's no quicker way to offend a Tasmanian than to leave them off the map. Okay. Oh, one more thing. Some people observe that Shikoku looks a little bit like the shape of Australia. You can think of that as you may. Okay. The old universities are referred to as sandstone universities. So they've all got stone architecture and very much inspired by the architecture of Oxford and Cambridge. Okay. Oxbridge. Interestingly, the Australian universities follow a very British influence. We have these image of the medieval university, but I think Bacon Sensei probably emphasized this as well too. What is really striking is from the late 19th century in particular, British universities actually became very specialized, the newer universities. Oxford and Cambridge as these ancient universities, really medieval universities, educating elites. They had a very, very habahiroi kind of liberal arts, prided themselves on not being particularly applied to the world at large. However, there was, at the same time, there was also another tradition in Europe, in places like Bologna and Edinburgh in Scotland, which emphasized more applied knowledge, particularly medicine and economics. And many of the great contributions to knowledge creation, you know, economists like Adam Smith, and for example, and David Ricardo, they were at Edinburgh, and then they were at Glasgow. So the Scottish institutions really pushed towards a more applied vocational way. Then with industrialization in Britain, the universities, with some support from growing business communities, really expanded their education model to bring in a whole range of new disciplines. There's always been a little bit of a tension between that kind of applied knowledge and more abstract academic work. Glasgow was a huge pioneer, because Glasgow was a real center of industrialization with the shipping industry and whatnot. And there was a lot of demand for talented, well-educated employees to go to work, and whether it's engineering and management and whatnot, there was kind of the workshop for the British Empire. And so this is where the model of the lecture and the tutorial, ちょっと大人数の講義、そして少人数クラス、両方やるね、各科目で。So this was the lecture plus tutorial model that was kind of pioneered in the late 19th century in Britain. And when the Australian universities were created, that was directly brought in. And so that's still a key feature of Australian and New Zealand systems. And you'll see that does apply too in many bigger institutions in the United States. But continental Europe, much of Europe does not have the lecture and tutorial model. And when Japan imported the model of the universities. They brought it more directly from Germany, which did not have the tutorial model. So it tends to be often hundreds of students in a class with no kind of shōninzu kyoiku as well. So it's a hybrid model that was developed in the particular circumstances in Britain, which was then carried over to Australia, New Zealand, and to a significant degree, actually, if you go to places like Singapore and Hong Kong, also very much influenced by those kind of models. So key point here is that the universities tend to be much larger, Sogo Daigaku, than liberal arts colleges, okay, but also have small group tutorial classes. So it isn't a hybrid thing that's easy to miss. Very briefly, I'm conscious of time here and we want to interact. University of Sydney, obviously very much influenced by Oxford and Cambridge style, right smack bang in the middle of the city, beautiful campus. Australian National University, very prestigious, was built after World War II, after the shock of World War II. Its architecture is now much loved mid-century kind of modernism, and it's a very striking campus. That's University House there, for example, but a lot of money in the research institutions there. So the School of Medical Research, for example, very, very striking. The Research School of Chemistry, for example, at the Australian National University. It's a very striking campus. Now, a couple of things to emphasize in terms of comparatively thinking about universities. This is true for Australia, but it's also true for a number of other countries too. Very different from Japan, okay? And so another really important point. Can you see me winking? I can't really wink, 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 hint, 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 note, listen up, pay attention. Don't know why, but should pay attention, okay? Go back. The field of study, not the university, most impacts future earnings, okay? So yes, we have kind of a hierarchy in terms of university prestige in some sense, but it's kind of like a matrix structure. Within maybe universities that overall a little bit prestigious, less prestigious, particular faculties are very well respected. So you may have these very old universities, but new universities have created particularly interesting kind of programs, and students go there and it's competitive to get into them. And generally future earnings as new graduates, employees, has much more to do with what you study rather than where you studied it, okay? So, まあ簡単に言うと、オーストラリアの高等教育、専門性は非常に高くて、そして利はまり、労働市場に出ると、マーケットに出ると、やはりそのリターンが結局、どこまで自分の成績が良かったし、どこまでもう専門性の高い知識を受けているか、教育を受けているかどうかはすごく重大。Okay? So, in a Japanese case, I mean, it's just a rough way to say it, but people try and get into the most exclusive place they can based on hensachi. Hensachi 一番高いところでなるべく入りたがっている人多いね。And this idea that you just ちょっと mounting 的な you get to the place that's more prestigious, and people obsess over that. And one of the really interesting things is you ask so many, I'm sure you can test yourselves on this. Intuitively, so many people have internalized the relative rankings of particular faculties and universities. And I think that's an enormous trap to fall into, because what it means is you end up just simply trading on your status based on where you happen to get into, not what you've achieved. And the world is becoming ever more meritocratic. Okay? 本当に実力主義、どんどんそうね。So people really don't care after a couple of years where you went to university. They're interested in what you can do. So if you get a head start in terms of developing good skill set in the university, it can take you a long way. And so it's not uncommon in Australia, New Zealand, and a number of places increasingly, to see people in senior leadership roles who graduated from genuinely easy to get into colleges, but once they got into college, they studied very hard. That said, Australian universities, our partners, and our New Zealand partners are very prestigious places. But just because you graduate from a prestigious place doesn't mean that you're going to make a lot of money. The first thing is grades matter enormously. People actually, demonstrate that they are talented by actually getting good grades. Now, critical thing is, like everywhere, higher education has been expanding, but in the Australian and New Zealand case, both, but particularly in the Australian case, international students, the numbers grew enormously. International students generally paid much higher fees. And so there was a pretty clear cross subsidy from the international students to the domestic students and to research. And with COVID stopping new international student recruitment, this has had a huge financial impact on the universities. One other very important point you wouldn't want to miss is a dramatic transformation in terms of gender balance. This is the Australia-New Zealand case, but we're seeing this in quite a number of other countries too. So it's not unique to Australia and New Zealand. It's particularly strong there. In terms of enrollment by gender, female students have well overtaken male students. What's most interesting is some professions that historically were some of the most prestigious are becoming more and more female dominated. The law, for example, media, the law, medicine, women are significantly overtaking men, not just in admission to programs, but of course, everywhere, like in SILS, on average, let's be honest, girls are just smarter or they work harder. But on average, the GPA, hairkin taking a GPA for the girls is better. Hey, power to the women, as it should be, okay? Guys, you're an embarrassment. Ganbatte. You're letting the side down, okay? The implications of this is a whole bunch of professions are becoming in a very good way, feminized in Western countries, strikingly so in the Australian case. This is former Foreign Minister Julie Bishop, totally awesome individual. I support a different political party, but I have enormous respect for her. Actually, not long before COVID, I had a chance to meet her at a higher education event in Australia. By the way, she was formerly the head of a top law firm, and her death stare is legendary. If someone says something very stupid, you're in trouble, because she never says anything. She just kind of gives you the death stare. She just kind of looks at you, and pure humiliation. Okay, University of Queensland, quick example, UQ, not UQ Mobile, but I do use UQ Mobile because I'm a graduate of UQ and it makes me feel good, and the UQ Association. This is Brisbane, the Weavy River. The university's across the river, okay, as we can see here. Beautiful campus, okay. Started off downtown in the city, but then moved out to this spectacular kind of Art Deco, hybrid Byzantine Art Deco building in very nice, one of the most prestigious parts of Brisbane. Interestingly, before the students could ever move in, World War II started, and General Douglas MacArthur, when they got kicked out of the Philippines, moved his South Pacific Command into the University of Queensland building. I have sat and had seminars in a room that used to be Douglas MacArthur's office when I was an undergraduate, okay? That's the quadrangle there. Nice and stone. That's it back in 1986, and God forbid someone posted this on Facebook, so I found it. Oops, I went backwards. That's me at the back there with a bad Duran Duran haircut. I was the vice president of the student union at the time. That's why that picture has turned up. It's a little bit scary. Guy next to me, by the way, went on to be a senator. Okay, simple rule if you're in Australia and New Zealand, or South Africa for that matter, when the jacarandas, which are absolutely stunning, start to bloom, you should be studying. The old rule of thumb is, no, jacaranda ga ne, mankai ni naru made ni shikari benkyou shinai to kanarazu kimatsu tesu ni ochiru. So that was the kind of the marker of it. Now, pandemic reality check. Dive into this and then we'll do a Q&A. Okay. Australia and New Zealand are very rare cases of almost complete COVID elimination. Last week, there was one person in Sydney had COVID. They knew exactly who he was, where he went, and everybody knew where he went because they have tracing and they put it in the newspaper. It's really humiliating. They don't publish your name, but like every time, 15 minutes, he was here, 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 and here. And anyone who was there, you have to stay home for 2 weeks, including the Treasurer of New South Wales, Zymud Asian, happened to be in the same coffee shop as this one guy for like 15 minutes at 11:45 or something on a Tuesday morning. And so the Treasurer had to stay home for 2 weeks. So COVID is not a problem. The problem is Australia and New Zealand got there by completely closing their borders. And now they're trapped. And this is another important point. Because COVID is not a problem, it's not easy to go and study abroad there. Hint, 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 important point. Okay? COVIDがないからこそ入国できません。そういう場合もあります。Okay? So in a funny kind of way, those countries that are most open to international students are the ones that generally didn't completely get COVID under control. Interestingly, those countries that had the biggest COVID problem but also had money also quickly got vaccinations under control. So the UK and the US. Those countries that closed their borders, eliminated COVID, didn't feel the need to rush for vaccines. They just kind of wait and let's find out which ones work best. No side effects. And now they're caught out. And this includes, unfortunately, Taiwan now, which has gone to another lockdown. Singapore has been a bit faster on vaccinations. One country which is initially quick to close, but then had an outbreak, Israel threw a lot of money at getting the vaccinations very quickly. And you see the news, well, right, the last week it's been terrible on the news with the rocket attacks. And that's really, really tragic for everyone involved. But have effectively got back to normal through vaccines. So the real news is very simple. For places like Australia and New Zealand, and it will be true for Taiwan, it will be true for Hong Kong, for Singapore and whatnot, is once their population is widely vaccinated, then the border access will be pretty much kind of guaranteed, okay? And this is not just about excluding foreigners. I have not been back home to Australia since it started, and I'm not expecting to get home until the middle of next year. And this is intensely painful for me because both of my parents have been in a very bad way health-wise. My mum was in hospital for 6 months, and I wasn't able to do anything to help her, which has been really, really, really bad. I could go back if I could get a flight, but Australia has capped total quotas. So there's only 6,000 arrivals a week. Most airlines don't fly. ANA and JAL both send a few flights a week, but because they can only put 30 to 40 people on them, they're only selling very expensive tickets. And even if you could get there, you then have kyosei kakure, 2 weeks compulsory quarantine at jikoftan, no, $3,000 Australian, which is about 25 man, okay? So this is the awkward situation. Next, extremely painful truth, embarrassing for me and makes me really quite angry as an Australian, that we have 100,000 students already with a valid student visa are stuck outside Australia. Most of them are Chinese, because unfortunately when Corona first spread, it was Chinese New Year, and more than half of all Chinese students in Australia had returned home for the Chinese New Year because there was the summer holiday at the time. And they got stuck overseas, okay? So Australian universities' first priority is to get their existing students back into the country, which means new exchange students are a much lower priority. And there's been various proposals, but politically, the government has been slow and afraid of taking risks. And it's so extreme that actually state governments have been closing the borders to fellow Australians from other states. 1 or 2 cases in New South Wales, bang, the border to Queensland closes, okay? And I'll get really personal on this. The Premier of the state of Queensland is a very old friend of mine. We were at university together. We were together very briefly once upon a time. The political calculus is unfortunately very much about you know, keeping Australians, keeping the community safe. And this is the trap of COVID elimination. When no one has to wear a mask, when everyone can just go shopping, when it's back to normal, and then you see these shocking images from overseas, there is not a political will to take a risk. So everything depends on widespread vaccination, okay? At the same time, the universities are getting crunched, and we're looking at time, I'm just going to skip through this. You know, until COVID-19, education was Australia's third largest export, and in New Zealand, I think it was its fourth largest export. And I've got some figures of those of you interested here on revenue. This was a huge source of revenue. The universities are getting crunched at the moment. A friend of mine's a Deputy Vice Chancellor International of the university, and he says it's like Armageddon. It's just a nightmare. Several of my friends have taken big cash payments from the university to quit. It's better to leave than be sacked. So it's a real crunch for the universities. The flip side is, as soon as they can reopen the borders, they will be incredibly welcoming of international students to come back. Okay. Now, it angers me and embarrasses me that more mechanisms weren't created for quarantine to bring international students back to Australian universities. Japan's doing exactly the same thing now. We have a bunch of, maybe some of you are joining remotely. We have some Waseda students, including a emissary of mine who's stuck in France because the embassy won't even process her visa renewal. And I myself am wondering, I'm getting political here, I'm wondering, 90,000 officials to come with the Olympics, but a bunch of existing Waseda students who committed years of their lives to their program are not allowed to re-enter Japan. You know, so Japan is kind of doing it not as badly, but almost as badly as what my own country is doing. So, God. Okay, short term, nobody knows. Okay, too many uncertainties, can't make any promises. However, I'm extremely optimistic that study abroad will be back to normal by February of 2022. So exchange for Australia and New Zealand, very confidently back to normal. Fall next year, it should be. But there's such a backlog of international students, although many will have graduated by then because of doing online programs and whatnot. It's not absolutely certain. It's probably a lot safer to apply to go to the US or Canada or Denmark or somewhere like that for fall of next year. I think that's much more certain. But for exchange from the following year, if you don't mind waiting until then, I'm very confident that'll be good. And there'll be work opportunities. And I tell you one thing that the Australian government will never tell you, Waseda will never tell you, but Australia, the whole economy depends on migrants, okay? And we haven't had migrants for a number of years. There are desperate skills shortages. So if you were to go on exchange from February 2022 with work permissions, you can get work there, and I strongly suspect you'd be in a good position to even seek a full-time job afterwards. There's visa processes and all the rest of it, but I think there is going to be such a desperate hunt for talent that there are real career opportunities. So that's another topic for another day. Yoroshiku. That was the Australia's Prime Minister coming to see the Japanese Prime Minister. So I'll stop it there. Happy to have Q&A. It's rather long. And I don't mind staying on a bit longer too, so I don't feel the time constraints. We don't have the usual room constraints. So who'd like to kick off and ask questions? And anything, be incredibly blunt. I don't care. I won't take any offense as an Australian. Oh, by the way, I'm a quasi-New Zealander for the very simple reason that everyone with an Australian passport also automatically has Educan for New Zealand. So I can just go and live in New Zealand if I like. And that's actually a very attractive proposition. That's another option for me. So over to yourselves. Just unmute, call out. I don't care about process. Don't worry about putting hands up or anything like that.
So one thing I heard from my high school teacher and I was really interested in is that, so for example, if you go to Australia for 4 years
Mm.
and like study there, like go to college normally without like study abroad, and then like, but you don't have like money to pay, and then you like go, oh, and you maybe like not pay for like the university, like you go like back to your own country, for example. Like I heard that like my teacher didn't pay, and because he works in Japan, he doesn't have to pay for his
Okay,
college.
okay.
So like if you work in Australia, I think like you have to
To
pay.
yes. Look, in that,
Is it
so
true?
your teacher was an Australian citizen, right?
Yeah, so he's Australian, but he works in Japan right now.
Yes. The yeah, it's what we call HECS, Higher Education Contribution Scheme. And that's a major factor for why actually university participation increased so rapidly, because there's no sakibarai. You get accepted to the university, and then the government pays the university for you and keeps a record. And once you start earning over a certain income, they just add a surcharge to your tax. Okay, it's what we call an income contingent loan scheme. It's the world's best way to do it. It's super efficient because the government decides how much it will pay the universities. See, the problem is the US kind of had a loan scheme thing, but no price controls. So US universities got hugely expensive, like $60,000 a year for some universities. But students would get a loan, right? And so as a huge, Joe Biden has promised actually restructuring of student debt. Because it's just a crisis. There are people with hundreds of thousands of debt. The Australian case, the government controls the prices, it pays the university, so the university get a stable income. And then you only have to pay it back once you start to earn over a certain amount, which means that if you're unfortunate, your career doesn't go well, or you're ill or whatever, like, my sister's never going to pay it back. Now, you're quite right. Up until I think this year, Australians who went abroad, because they, unlike the US, see, I never do a tax return. In the United States, you have to do a tax return. Okay, so American colleagues here, they have to do Japanese kakute shinkoku, and they have to do an American one, tax return. Australians don't have to do it. You just simply declare yourself a non-resident. So officially no income in Australia. So up until this year, no one had to pay. And New Zealand copied the system, but then New Zealand had a bit of a public debt problem. So New Zealand moved earlier to declare that non-residents had to pay a certain amount. They had to pay back a couple of thousand each year or something. And just recently, the Australian government kind of copied it. So yeah, oh, yeah.
Okay.
It's now, the interesting thing is there have been proposals to copy this system in Japan. But first of all, the Zaimosho freaked out because they said, well, you've got millions of people already. Most Japanese families are already, well, その学費払うのを覚悟してるから。だから必要じゃない。So they didn't move to that. And the other thing is, a lot of people don't realize this, but except for Kokuretsu Daigaku, Monkasho controls the number of students in private universities, but it doesn't control the price. The Japanese government cannot tell Waseda how much we should charge. They only tell us the number. So they control quantity, they don't control price. So what keeps, this is area I'm actually involved in research with some of the leading scholars internationally on the pricing of higher education. So it's not just me. I'm kind of doing this comparatively. What's really interesting is what keeps gakuhi reasonable in Japan is the amount that a middle class family can pay. Okay, これ以上高くすると、普通の例えばサラリーマンの場合は、共働きじゃない場合は、親は払えないから、So this is like a natural kind of price cap. And Japanese banks are incredibly conservative. They rarely lend for university fees. And even if they do, it's a terrible interest rate. Because we learn, when we look at university systems, we learn a lot about different cultures and everything. In America, American financial institutions are very good at calculating risk. And they, like, if you get accepted into Harvard Business School, you go to an American bank, they will give you the money to pay Harvard. You get accepted into Todai, you go along to a Japanese bank, they'll go, and then they'll want a whole bunch of guarantees and everything. And the people who need the bank loan, they would have already, you know, if your uncle can give the guarantee, he would have lent you the money, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So multiple. No, so having the state step in worked well. So, and I think that's, you know, because there's a lot of people watching here who maybe not interested in Australia and New Zealand, but they want to learn about university systems. One of the really huge differences throughout the world is who pays for university education and how much, and what are the implications. And for everyone listening, a quick summary version of this super simple version is where university is completely free because the government pays, one of two things. Everyone can go and it's really shit. Or it's kind of elite and really good, but lots of people can't go. Okay. And that's been, you know, we look at Denmark and Sweden and whatnot. They're kind of the exception, but that's because everyone pays really, really high taxes. If you look at France, where the universities are free, huge classrooms, overcrowding, and in some universities, only about 20% of students graduate. So, except for the Grandes Écoles, that's a separate story. So the Japanese case, kind of parents are paying. And I guess that's one other thing too, that, you know, 80% of university students in Japan are in private universities. So there's another aspect. But great question, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, folks, very specific, I'll promise quick answers, speedy answers for those of you who can't hang around. Very practical questions about applying of study abroad anywhere, not just Australia, New Zealand. Okay. Okay. What kind of job can international students get in Australia? Heard it's difficult for people from other countries to get a job. It was relatively difficult. It varies. It depends on what you've studied. You know, if you've done studies that have skills that you can use straight away, then no, it was relatively easy. And you ask about it, you say it's not related to exchange program, but no, it's fine. These are really important kind of questions. Okay. But as I said, you know, the Australia is booming. Sydney real estate prices went up 20% in the last 2 months. I mean, that's how crazy it is. But there's a huge shortage of people. So you can pretty much get any kind of, right now, they just do not have, I mean, one of the top stories in Sydney Morning Herald over the weekend was that there's something like 20,000 places at the moment for even just wait staff, serving staff in restaurants and whatnot. So any kind of hospitality services, hotels, all of these kinds of things. Okay. So very relevant. One thing, by the way, I would encourage you to think more expansively about your exchange and everything. I'm sure we've got some Waseda faculty admin staff listening in and whatnot. But if you're thinking about subsequently going on at your own expense to do further studies, keep in mind that some university systems will give credit for your Waseda studies. I know students, for example, who went on exchange for a year to Sweden and then enrolled as a degree student, had their Swedish studies recognized, had SIL studies recognized, and did just 1 more year's study in Sweden and effectively got themselves a degree. Depending on the program, that's actually possible in Australia too. So you can kind of do this kind of DIY double degree by going back as a fee-paying student yourself after your SILS experience, or even doing QGUC and doing it and then coming back or something. Okay. Apply for exchange programs in Australia. When do we go in Australia? Is it February 2022 or February 2022? And the recruitment will be May next year. Oh, 2023. Sorry. Forgive me. Yeah, no, you're quite right. 2023. Dear me. Time flies when you're not having fun, hey, with Corona. Okay, 2023. By the way, that's a classic sign of getting old, right? The years just kind of run into each other. Yeah, 2023. Oh my God. I'm still thinking when I grow up, I want to be a fireman, and I suddenly realized, God, I'm 54 years old. Yeah, no, 2023, forgive me. Okay, 2023. That's because we're in 2021 now. Yeah, forgive me. So I was absolutely confusing people when I was saying that. So the recruitment already happened for February next year, and some people are holding already an internal gakanai no senko, holding a kind of a confirmation of being selected internally to apply to an Australian program or New Zealand program for February next year. But there is a real question mark of whether they can go. And I'm quite pessimistic for them. I feel very, very sorry for them. Okay. Then there will, I want to emphasize there are several exchange programs which is officially fall. But why the academic calendar is a problem is, as I said, that they start from late July. So we have Griffith University, which has 3 sites, but I recommend people go to the Gold Coast because it's really nice. There's a Brisbane campus too, but the Gold Coast is particularly nice. And there's also Murdoch in Sydney, and we had Melbourne. I'm not sure that that's back again. But so you finish here, Zenki awatte sugu ikanakshi no bai ni yotte tokubetsu ni kyoen tachi ni onegai shite hayame ni kimatsu ukisasete moratte sugu iku. So it's very giddy. This is the problem with our academic calendar. It's the Corky in Australia starts just at the time that Kochi no Zenki awaru timing there. So that's the pinch, okay? But as I say, I think for 20, it will be an interesting question. What does the Dugak Center do in the Aki Boshu fall Boshu? Because officially they will have a couple of programs they will recruit for exchange for fall. They will call it fall 2022 departure. But giddy, okay, as to whether the border will be fully open, you get accepted. I hope it would be, but literally the words of the Australian Prime Minister was reaffirming the likelihood that Australian borders will be opening up mid-2022. That's why it pains me as an Australian to say this, but the safe thing to do for those of you who will be applying in October, October is the recruitment for fall next year, I wouldn't apply to Australia or New Zealand. I would be applying to one of those countries that is doing very well in vaccine rollout and who is already recruiting students and is already open for students. Remember, I think many of you will have heard, Waseda's policy now is for all of your senpai who should be leaving in the fall, that if your destination country is shaded purple on the MOFA map as of May 31st, so that's 2 or above on a 4-point scale, you can't go, okay? Now I have various views on this. Before the missiles even started flying in Israel, Israel was listed as 3, and Israel leads the world in terms of vaccine rollout, and it's had hardly any cases now. It's dramatically successful. The news is there all the time. So I think Gaimasho is less than useless on this. I think they're not even useless. They're worse than useless. They're just being super cautious. No one wants to take responsibility. What I cannot understand is why on the Gaimasho website, Israel not for missiles, but for Corona is 3, but Syria is 2. Okay. I think the hospital system is just so broken in Syria that they just stopped counting COVID cases. And so therefore, I don't know, maybe some ODA people want to go there or something. I don't know. It's bizarre. But even like Australia is 2. As I said, we've got one person with COVID in Sydney and we know where he is. He's at home, right? Okay. 2, stupid. Okay. Unfortunately, Waseda is in his awful position. You know, lots of people in Waseda know that Guy Michel is quite ikagen in their kind of risk assessment, okay? But it's a very bold institution that says to students it's okay to go, even though Guy Michel is saying differently. If any happened, you know, you'd lose a legal case. The reality is lots of students who are graduating Waseda are actually going to go and study abroad. Zemise went in September last year. She's in a fashion program in London. So if you wanted to quit Waseda and just go abroad, you can. Lots of, you know, Canada will take you, the United States will take you, you know, Denmark will take you, Ireland will take you. Okay. So what the thing that stops us outbound is actually Guy Michel, okay? But I think eventually, because, and this is where every Japanese business person is your friend. Everyone who needs to go to their subsidiary company, to their market, to see their clients, all of these kind of things, all of them want Guy Michel to be more realistic, okay? Because large organizations have the same problem. So I think that when the vaccination, when we're seeing the UK and the US, you know, corona numbers are dramatically coming down because of vaccination. So I think from fall of next year, there'll be lots of countries that you will be fine to go to. What you need to do, though, is when you apply in the fall of this year, make sure you pick a university in a country where the government has been very, very reasonable in terms of border policy and whatnot. And Scandinavia, particularly if I look at Denmark and Finland, for example, the UK, even France. France has been very hesitant to put restrictions on people coming from Japan, for example. So use current government policy as a key guide, plus the situation with the vaccine rollout. Much of Europe has been a real mess with rolling out vaccines. The EU's completely messed it up. The UK has been much, much better. Hopefully they'll get it sorted over time. Specific questions? I'm sure many of you have those concerns. So I thought I'd just say it all at once. Okay, specific questions? Please fire away. Those of you who don't have any questions, you know, feel free to go, of course. There's no obligation to stay. I'm not taking another round of attendance, so you can drop out. But anyone who wants to ask me something now, and it can be much, much broader, is fine too. I'm happy to hang around for a little bit. Okay. Thank you very much for your attention. I hopefully it's been useful for you. And anyone with a particular interest in Australia, just make contact with me. Happy to chat. Please, yeah, far away. Yep. Question? Yep. Oh, maybe someone just said thanks.
I have a question.
Please, yeah.
I'm thinking of going to Australia, but I'm kind of like scared because if I wait until this spring application, and at the time it's not open, I have no options left. And is it like?
Yeah. Look, I hear exactly what you're saying, and I think this has been the most difficult hurdle to overcome in terms of promoting study abroad to Australia. Just the fear that, you know, that's right. If you don't apply in the fall and then you wait, and then if you missed out, that risk. I have never seen someone miss out. I've never seen someone end up with nothing in the spring, you know, because Australian universities have very large Japanese studies programs and really want to send the students to Waseda on exchange. We've never had a problem with no like waku, okay? The only time it's ever been an issue was if a student, their English wasn't so great and they were kind of delaying their study abroad. They didn't go in the fall. They were hoping to get their English up to a higher level. And then they didn't get the score they needed to meet the exchange. So that's where kind of people got themselves a bit entangled. But for the people in that kind of situation, UGUC has had a couple of programs, spring departure for lower level, to kind of overcome that. So I don't think you should be afraid to delay for that reason.
Okay, thank you. I was like, I'm thinking of like this COVID situation.
Yeah.
Do you think like Australia and New Zealand is going to take the similar?
Yeah. I think their policies are remarkably similar. New Zealand led and Australia copied, but they're very much moving in kind of tandem. I'm very confident both of them. They're very wealthy countries, and they've now, both of them, although they've been slow with the vaccines, have contracts now to do more than enough. Indeed, Australia's going to end up with many more vaccines than they need. So Australia's going to give it away to other countries to try and make Australia look good. That's quite today. Sydney Morning Herald, that's a discussion, quite explicitly. We went crazy. It's like someone who was slow to order, and so therefore they ordered everything in a panic, and we're going to end up with far more than they ever need. So vaccination won't be a problem. And the universities, well, again, the headline story in Sydney Morning Herald today is, you're killing us, one of the senior university leaders. So the universities will be very committed to getting international students back. So I'm extremely confident that by, February 2023, I'm so glad that student corrected, Masahiro, that to be fine and that there'll be a place for you. But the other thing is, I know psychologically, just when so many people are around you are applying for study abroad in the fall, to be a bit kind of nakamahazuru and to say, no, I'm going to wait and apply later. It doesn't feel right. Okay. But I do encourage people to do it. So. Okay.
Thank you.
Cheers. Other questions? Anybody?
Sorry again. You said
Please,
you can get a visa. Is that a working visa or something? Okay.
Well, first of all, we go on a student visa, of course, but the student visa allows people to work. So I'm not sure if they've changed it slightly, whether you actually have to go and get a separate permission. At one point, you're doing it like in the Japanese case, you had to apply to just get a permission in it. But I think it's automated now. I don't think you even need to do that. And in the break, you can work full time. Which means that, for example, over the summer period, for example, you can do the equivalent of a full internship or a short full-time job. If you were then subsequently wanting, once you graduated, to work back in Australia, then there's the whole process of being sponsored by an employer for temporary visas. That actually, the numbers have been huge. The number of people have been sponsored by employers. Now, it does help if you've had a bit of other work experience already, but they're fairly loose definitions, of this. So if you're doing relevant kind of part-time work while you're a student, adding it all up, you often meet these kind of sponsorship requirements anyway. One of the implications, by the way, I'm always telling students, is get your LinkedIn profile set up and get as many interesting experiences as you can. That those things actually even count, if you're applying for a work visa subsequently. But as I suggested earlier, once we get back to a kind of post-COVID border regime, I think the working visa requirements will be easier than they have ever been. There's several, not two, but several major government analyses, which estimates that Australia's rate of economic growth will drop dramatically because we don't have the, normally we have like net migration of something like 200,000 a year. To keep this in perspective, Australia over the last 30 years has added like 1% to its population every year through migration, if you think of what that would involve for Japan, if Japan was to take 1.2 million migrants a year, you get a sense of the scale of Australia's reliance on migrants. And it's been a real source of economic dynamism. And so that's really what the business community wants. So I think it's going to be relatively easy in the future. The other option for anyone who's a Japanese citizen or a Korean citizen, I think a resident of Hong Kong, not PRC, there are working holiday visas available as well too. Now, I'm not here to promote working holidays, but if anyone, if they're desperately sick of online study and they want to do Kyugaku for a year, then once the border opens, that's always another option. Or once you've graduated, if you don't get an IT, get a working holiday visa and go to Australia and work for a year. That can work quite well. That's how I first came to Japan. I finished my master's thesis at the University of Queensland. I submitted my thesis, and 2 days later, I got a flight to Tokyo with a working holiday visa. Had a job in no time. So yeah.
Thank you.
Cheers. Any other questions? If not, I'll close down Zoom then, but anyone who's interested in Australia, feel free to shoot me an email anytime you like, and happy to have one-on-one Zoom chat, or we can do socially distanced discussion in my office if you like. So thank you very much, everybody, for your engagement, and all the best with your studies, and stay healthy and everything. So thank you. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Professor. Can I ask you one thing?
Yes, please. Yes.
Okay, I'm